You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 269, the Ballston Raid. Over the course of 1780, most of the large-scale fighting took place in the Carolinas, where the British still contended to govern, and where the hope of loyalists rising to supplement their ranks still gave the leadership the incentive to commit resources there. Yet, despite the loss of Burgoyne's army and the devastating attacks on native settlements during the Sullivan Campaign, many loyalists from upstate New York still contended for control of that region. We last left this fight back in episode 250, when raids under Mohawk leader Joseph Brant and loyalists under John Johnson wrought havoc in the area through the spring and summer of 1780. Despite the ability to capture any territory, these raids continued into the fall and winter. A year earlier, in 1779, the Americans had hit Iroquois settlements, successfully forcing them to retreat into Canada. The Americans had burned their homes and food for the winter. In the fall of 1780, the British planned to do pretty much the same thing to the Americans living there. They launched a series of raids designed to burn the homes and destroy the crops of rebels in the region just before harvest time. The governor of Canada in 1780 was General Frederick Haldimand. I've given background on Haldimand before, way back in episode 62 when he was leaving Boston in 1775, and also in episode 197 when he returned to Quebec as its new governor. Despite his qualifications, Haldimand got the job almost by default. Secretary of State Lord Germain hated his predecessor, Governor Guy Carleton, and wanted him out. As a military leader, Carleton's obvious successor would have been General John Burgoyne. That is until John Burgoyne surrendered his army at Saratoga. Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton, who also had a military background, might have been a good choice, but Hamilton had spent the last couple of years as a POW of Virginia and showed no signs of being able to return to Canada anytime soon. By comparison, Haldimand was the ideal candidate for the job. He had served as acting governor of Quebec before the war. He had experience over the same region from his time in the French and Indian War, and he was also a senior lieutenant general. He spoke English, French, and German, all of which were important. Canada had large English and French-speaking populations at the time, and half the army stationed in Canada were German-speaking Brunswickers. Despite all this, the major obstacle to Haldimand's appointment was the place of his birth. Haldimand had been born and raised in Switzerland, from a Prussian family who lived there for several generations. He'd gotten his start in the Prussian army and served in the Dutch army for a while. The British had recruited him just before the start of the French and Indian War as part of an effort to get experienced officers who could raise regiments among the German-speaking population in Pennsylvania. In addition to being of foreign birth, Haldimand had no friends or family with political influence in London. And of course, that was the fastest way for officers to rise through the ranks. So despite this lack of connection, Haldimand had risen to Major General by 1772. That, however, created a new problem in 1775. As London was getting ready to recall General Thomas Gage, General Haldimand would have been next in line in terms of seniority, ahead of Generals Howe, Clinton, and Burgoyne. London did not want a foreigner in command of North American forces, and giving that job to a less senior general would have been an insult to Haldimand. So the same ship that carried Howe, Clinton, and Burgoyne to Boston also carried a message recalling Haldimand to London. So for most of the next several years, London officials kept one of their most senior British generals, with the most experience in North America, just hanging around London with nothing to do. While the war was raging in New York in 1776, Haldimand took a few months on vacation to visit his hometown in Switzerland. By 1777, with Secretary Germain finally getting General Carleton to resign as governor and military commander of Quebec, he offered the job to Haldimand. Thanks to weather and other problems, Haldimand did not arrive in Quebec until late 1778. The problem for Haldimand was now that he wasn't sure what to do in Quebec. Germain even apologized to Haldimand for not being able to give him specific expectations of his new job. After Burgoyne's fiasco at Saratoga, strategists had given up on the idea of creating a link between Quebec and New York that would cut off New England. They were now thinking more defensively, holding Quebec against any new invasions from the south. Remember that the Continental Congress, about this time, was making plans to have General Lafayette lead an invasion that would motivate the French inhabitants to rise up and overthrow British rule. Now, even though the Americans didn't have the resources to put together their planned invasion, they were very interested in the idea, and the British very much feared it. As military governor, Haldimand took a firm hand, arresting several newspaper editors and others who propagated what Haldimand called a, quote, licentious spirit. But the local inhabitants proved to be a minor concern. Haldimand was more concerned with preventing an invasion from the south. Remember that at this time the Quebec territory extended all the way down to what is today Kentucky, and the Americans occupied a good portion of that Quebec territory thanks to George Rogers Clark. Haldimand could not really worry about his southern territories. He focused more on the region around Lake Champlain, which might serve as an invasion point from New York. Soon after his arrival in 1778, Haldimand approved several raids into New York, mostly designed to liberate Loyalists who were under house arrest so they could join forces in Quebec. Haldimand had many Loyalists, as well as the Iroquois, who wanted to bring the war back to New York and retake their homes. He was still dealing with refugees from the Sullivan Campaign in late 1779. Haldimand had never gotten the reinforcements that Germain had promised him. He had nowhere near the manpower needed to take and hold parts of New York. But the British were quite capable of continuing their raids into New York. Launching another offensive raid into New York accomplished several things. It would keep the Americans from having a safe platform from which to launch a new invasion into Quebec. It would deny food being grown there that would help feed the Continental and French armies. It would also give the Loyalist and Iroquois refugees an opportunity for some payback, even a chance of eventually regaining some of their land. This is what the Loyalists constantly requested of Haldimand. The British had already launched raids into New York over the spring and summer of 1780, and now they were preparing for a fall offensive. Major Christopher Carleton, the nephew of General Guy Carleton, had remained in Canada after his uncle's departure. I mentioned him last in episode 202, when Carleton led several relatively uneventful raids through northern New York. Major Carleton led a force of British regulars down from St. John's in Canada, leaving on September 28, 1780. The assembled force he had included about 650 British regulars and another 200 or so Loyalists. The invasion force filled 8 ships and 26 smaller bateaux, reaching Valcour Island on October 2nd. As they moved down Lake Champlain, several parties of Indians joined them, expanding the force to almost 1,000 men. By October 6th, the fleet had reached Crown Point, where the unoccupied ruins of a fort remained. There, the Loyalists under Captain John Monroe separated from the main force, and we'll get to Monroe's expedition shortly. But for now, the rest of the force under Carleton continued to move south, passing the ruins of Fort Ticonderoga, also now unoccupied by either side. His fleet sailed down the South Bay, and when the ships could go no further, the group disembarked and continued overland. By October 9th, his force of about 650 men reached the rebel-occupied Fort Anne. The massive force of regulars, along with a field cannon, came as a surprise to the smaller garrison at Fort Anne. The American commander, Captain Adele Sherwood, was in charge of the 74 militia officers and men at the fort. The garrison had almost no rations or ammunition to face any sort of siege. Sherwood later reported that he only had rations for 3 or 4 days, and only about 4 rounds of ammunition per man. Given the overwhelming force against them, there was no prospect of a defense. Major Carleton sent forward a flag of truce and offered little in the way of surrender terms. They would be taken prisoner of war back to Quebec, and any women and children at the fort would be released unmolested to go home. Captain Sherwood surrendered the fort without a shot fired. The British moved through the region, burning or pillaging whatever they could find. The British column continued to move south toward Fort Edward. At Kingsbury, they ran into a couple of locals on horseback. The men escaped capture and rode to Fort Edward to warn the garrison. After that, instead of continuing south, the British column turned northwest and headed overland to Fort George, which was at the southern tip of Lake George. Like Fort Anne, the garrison at Fort George was rather small and lacked sufficient food or ammunition for any sort of siege. The garrison there consisted of Continentals from Colonel Seth Warner's regiment, many former Green Mountain Boys. Colonel Warner was away recovering from a wound that he had received about a month earlier. The second in command, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Safford, was also away trying to chase down the regiment's paymaster after he had escaped arrest for embezzlement, selling the regiment's new uniforms. The third in command should have been Major Gideon Brownson, but he was already a prisoner of war in Canada, so the command of Fort George fell to Captain John Chipman. Captain Chipman had been focusing on several British ships on Lake George to the north of the fort. He was preparing for an attack, but regardless of any preparation, he really lacked the men, ammunition, and rations to resist an attack of any real size. Chipman sent a rider to nearby Fort Edward to request additional food. The rider didn't make it to Fort Edward, as he spotted a group of about 30 or 40 hostile Indians who chased him right back to Fort George. Desperate for food, Chipman ordered a detail under the command of Captain Thomas Sill to go out and clear the road between Fort George and Fort Edward of any hostile war parties. Sill's detail left the fort on October 11th and came into contact with the advance of Major Carleton's British regulars, and so they also had to make a quick escape. Sill then organized his small detail and launched an attack on the pursuing enemy. Sill's force of 47 officers and men soon realized they weren't facing a small war party, but a fairly large force of British regulars, probably close to 200 men. The Continentals found themselves surrounded. Unwilling to surrender, Sill ordered a bayonet charge with the hope of pushing through the enemy line and returning to Fort George. The fight was a desperate one. Captain Sill and 18 other men were killed in the fighting, and another 14 were wounded or captured. Another 14 managed to get through the lines and escape. The British force then approached Fort George and began to form a line of battle. The Americans fired from their one cannon, but didn't manage to hit the enemy. Carleton then sent out a flag of truce calling for the fort's surrender. Half of the garrison had already been lost under Captain Sill. As a result, Chipman only had about 40 soldiers in the fort. Lacking enough food or ammunition to hold out for even a day or two, Captain Chipman surrendered the fort. Carleton offered similar terms to those he gave at Fort Anne. The garrison would be taken as prisoners of war and not massacred or otherwise attacked. Prisoners would be allowed to keep a knapsack full of personal items. Women and children would be permitted to return home with their baggage. Officers could keep their servants. Indians would not enter the fort until after the British took possession. And for some reason, Carleton added to the terms that one junior officer, an Ensign Bonnet, was permitted parole and allowed to return home with his family. I'm guessing that this maybe was a young man who was not really of prime fighting age. After the British had secured the fort, their Indian allies were given leave to plunder the fort of anything of value. After that, the British burned the fort before departing. The prisoners were marched up to Ticonderoga, where they were placed aboard ships and taken back to Quebec. Between Fort Anne and Fort George, the British collected about 130 prisoners of war. A few weeks later, Carleton would send a proposal for a prisoner swap, hoping to get back Loyalists who were being held in New York. However, the Americans would not agree, so most of the prisoners, at least those who survived, remained in custody until the end of the war. At this point, Major Carleton and his regulars did not plan to go any further. But another detachment that had moved out of Canada with Carleton planned to push even further south and continue the fighting. General Haldimand, before they even left Canada, had given authority to Captain John Munro to raid deeper into New York. Captain Munro was a Scotsman who first came to New York as a sergeant in the regular army during the French and Indian War. He had settled in Albany County and became a justice of the peace, where he spent much of the pre-revolution years fighting with Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. In 1775, Munro accepted a commission in a Loyalist militia, a fact that he denied to Patriot authorities in order to avoid arrest. But by mid-1776, the Patriots put out a warrant for his arrest anyway. After the Battle of Bennington in 1777, they seized all of Munro's land and property. By this time, Munro had left Canada, where he was serving in the King's Royal Regiment under Sir John Johnson. Captain Munro, in this attack, was tasked with continuing to raid further south toward Ballston, taking about 200 Loyalists and Mohawk warriors to destroy all Patriot properties and crops that they came across. On October 11th, the same day that Fort George fell to Carleton, Munro's detachment was somewhere northeast of Saratoga. The subsequent withdrawal of the regulars and the news that the locals were aware of his presence gave Munro pause. He didn't want to walk into an ambush. So his force spent several days making their way down old Indian trails in order to avoid detection by using the main roads. Munro knew there was another force of Loyalists to the south under the command of Colonel John Johnson, but he had received no word of Johnson's whereabouts, and Johnson had not launched any attack. Further, Carleton's raids on Fort Anne and Fort George had riled up the local patriots, and Munro began receiving word of a larger Patriot militia group gathering to his north, possibly cutting off any escape route. He heard rumors that 500 militia had gathered at Saratoga to confront his raiding party. Another concern was that Munro's men were about out of food and were exhausting themselves marching through the wilderness when they were avoiding these main roads. Munro decided to raid Ballston, an area just a few miles to the west of Saratoga. It was the closest settlement that would probably have food for his men. It would also give him an opportunity to score a success before withdrawing back to Canada. On the night of October 16th, Munro's raiders attacked the homes of several well-known Patriot militia officers, capturing several of them. This included Colonel James Gordon. The colonel was a prominent military and political leader who had served in the state assembly. He was specifically targeted for capture. His next-door neighbor, militia captain Tyrannus Collins, was also taken prisoner. Collins received a tomahawk wound while blocking his door so that his son could escape out a window. The wound was not mortal, and Collins became a prisoner. The Loyalists focused on destroying the homes and crops, avoiding a confrontation with the nearby militia fort where defenders had gathered. Munro reported taking about 30 prisoners and looting or destroying at least 17 farms. At this point, though, not wanting to push his luck, Munro withdrew by morning, moving into the mountains. There, his men rested and slaughtered some of their captured animals for food. It took more than a week for the force to reach Bulwaga Bay, about halfway up Lake George, where they were safely back within British lines. Now, the Munro raid created great alarm, destroying homes only a day's march from Albany. Retired General Philip Schuyler wrote to Governor George Clinton days after the Ballston raid. Schuyler commented that, quote, "The panic that has seized the people is incredible. With all my efforts, I cannot prevent numbers from deserting their habitations." Upon his return, Munro was concerned that his inability to connect with Johnson's force made his actions a disappointment to the British leadership. Although they said they were satisfied with his efforts, they never did give him another independent command. General Haldimand's strategy, however, was not for the raids by Carleton and Munro to have much impact by themselves. These raids were designed to distract the enemy from a much larger and more destructive raid on the Schoharie Valley of New York that was supposed to be taking place at the same time. And we'll have to get to those raids next time when we cover the Battle of Stone Arabia. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, and Michael Gaylord, and to Robert Morris Circle supporters Lee Seam and Michael Mulhern. Welcome to new standard bearers Donald Guetta, Trish Rodzniak, and John Tierney. For joining on Patreon at the $10 level or higher, you'll be getting the first of your monthly flag magnets later this month. Thanks also to Anthony Italiano and Tommy Quirk for one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. I also want to thank Lester Mallett, who, in addition to being a standard bearer supporter on Patreon, also keeps me supplied with glue dots, which I use to glue the magnets to the information sheets that I send to all my supporters on Patreon at the standard bearer level or higher. I want to remind everyone that I'm going to be at a live event at Washington's Crossing, Pennsylvania on Saturday, April 15th, 2023. I'm going to be one of a great many speakers there. There's going to be multiple panels, mostly of authors about books on the American Revolution. The event is completely free and open to the public. We've got full sponsorship to cover the costs. As I said, it's at Washington's Crossing State Park in Pennsylvania. You can find more details on my website at www.amrevpodcast.com. If you're in the region, you won't want to miss this. As I said, lots of great speakers. I plan on being there all day, and I look forward to chatting with anyone who can get there. Now, this week we began coverage of the fall raids of 1780 from Canada into New York. Although Britain by this time had given up on New York as a priority for conquest, the Loyalist colonists and native tribes that had been pushed out of New York were still more than eager to continue the fight. General Frederick Haldimand is, in my opinion, a really underappreciated leader from this era. He was in command of Canada at this time, and he was senior to every other British general that served in America during the Revolutionary War period, with the exception of Thomas Gage. I guess he's not really remembered because he never served as a commander-in-chief, and he never led the command in any major battle of the war. Haldimand was serving in New York before the war and also served in Ballston at the outbreak of the war, but left almost immediately after the war began, and when he returned to and stayed in Canada. When the war ended, Haldimand returned to London, and he died only a few years after that, so he wasn't involved in the Napoleonic Wars. He never had any children, but one of his nephews, William Haldimand, became a prominent member of Parliament and head of the Bank of England in the early 1800s. So, really fascinating guy. My book recommendation this week is one that gives good coverage of the events that I discussed today. The book is called The Burning of the Valleys, Daring Raids from Canada Against the New York Frontier in the Fall of 1780 by Gavin Watt. It's, as I said, a very thorough look at these events, over 250 pages of content, plus almost another 100 pages of appendices. If you want more details on the events that I discussed this week, and I'm going to continue to discuss next week, this is the book on the topic. I've recommended books by Watt before. He's written several good books about Revolutionary War events. He lives in Canada, Toronto specifically, and he definitely writes from the Loyalist perspective. His writing is engaging, and he dives deep into the facts. So, if you want to read more about today's topic, check out The Burning of the Valleys. My online recommendation is the one biography I know of for Frederick Haldimand. It's called simply Sir Frederick Haldimand by Jean N. Micklewraith. It was written in 1910, so it is public domain, and it's available on archive.org. Micklewraith was also from Toronto, which may explain her interest in Haldimand. given that he is much more relevant to Canadian history as its colonial governor. I'm going to try to answer 2 questions today since they're both relatively short and somewhat related. The first question asks, how much did soldiers in the American Revolution earn? Well, Continental privates were supposed to be paid $20 every 3 months, which would be about $500 to $600 in inflation-adjusted 2023 dollars. We're talking a little over $2,000 a year in current dollars. The pay, of course, went up with rank, so generals could actually earn $500 every 3 months. That would be the equivalent of about $15,000 today, so roughly the equivalent of earning $60,000 a year. One quick caveat when I'm talking about inflation-adjusted dollars, the inflation rate, once you get much before the early 1900s, is really more of an art than a skill in calculating, so you can see wide variations in the calculation of money. So take what I give you as a very general estimate and with somewhat of a grain of salt. But I do try to make the general point so that you have some understanding of what the money is worth, at least generally today. The problem with my answer, though, also is that although the soldiers were supposed to get paid this money, they often were not paid at all. And when they were, it was usually with paper money that had greatly depreciated. By 1781, the value of a continental dollar was about 225 to 1 for specie, that is, gold or silver dollars. So imagine trying to live today on about $1 a month in today's inflation-adjusted dollars. The reality was that soldiers were literally starving to death at times. Their clothes wore out and just fell off their bodies. Thousands of them died from exposure and malnutrition. No one was doing this for the money. Washington, of course, famously did not accept any salary at all. He worked for expenses only. Many officers, in addition to salary, used much of their own personal fortunes to further the cause, and they would also seek compensation from Congress later. By the end of the war, General Washington had incurred just over $160,000 in expenses. That would be millions of dollars today. After interest and depreciation, he submitted his claim to Congress for $499,000, probably more than $100 million in inflation-adjusted dollars today. I haven't found anyone who can conclusively tell me that Washington actually got paid all this money, but I suspect it may have happened once the federal government was installed and the new Constitution was able to raise money to pay off all the soldiers. The other question I had for today, and it's related, is how much did British soldiers get paid during the American Revolution? Well, unlike the Continentals, British regulars got paid much more regularly, and they got paid in specie. But they did not exactly get paid very well. Now, nominally, a private would be paid 8 pence per day. A pence is roughly the equivalent of about $1 in inflation-adjusted money. So, not a lot of money here. From that pay, officials would deduct money for food, uniforms, and other regimental costs. So even though a soldier would have a gross amount of 56 pence per week, the amount received after deductions would usually be around 18 to 20 pence per week. Again, inflation-adjusted dollars, we're talking $20 a week to live on. At the time, the money system in Britain, there were 240 pence in 1 British pound sterling. So after deductions, a soldier could expect to clear about 4 pounds per year. Of course, soldiers of higher rank got paid more, but even top regimental commanders earned less than 20 pounds per year. And you got to remember that the officers were spending hundreds or even thousands of pounds to buy their commissions in the first place, and then they also had to spend even more to present themselves properly as gentlemen with fine tailor-made uniforms, etc. So compare that pay with an unskilled civilian laborer at the time who would earn 30 to 40 pounds per year in the colonies. British officers, of course, were expected to come from good families and be independently wealthy. Enlisted men were most certainly not. So the poor pay was probably one reason so many soldiers opted to desert and start a new life in America. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me. via email or on Twitter, Facebook, or Quora. Well, that's all the time for today. I hope you will join us again next time for another American Revolution podcast.